Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube has revealed that only 19% of over 405,000 teachers employed in the country have been vetted against the National Register for Sex Offenders. She made the alarming remarks while answering questions in Parliament. Now, you'll know there's been a staggering number of sexual abuse cases involving teachers around the country. Let's bring in Clair Rankin now. She's an attorney at the Legal Resources Centre. Clair, thanks very much indeed for your time. I mean, this is incredibly unsettling, isn't it? And if memory serves, it costs between 40 and 70 rand to have a teacher vetted. Why is this not being done, to your understanding?
Well, to be honest, Michelle, it's difficult to say exactly. One, it just seems to be, and even though vetting is a legal requirement, there's not strong enough enforcement from the department when it comes to actually vetting. You'll see that when it comes to vetting educators, the onus falls on the educator's employer. So if it's a department appointed educator, it's the department themselves who are supposed to be vetting educators. If it's an SGB post in a school, then it falls on the SGB. When vetting is not happening, we're just simply not seeing adequate enforcement. The other issue is vetting and obtaining clearance certificates can take a considerable amount of time, can take upwards to 6 months even to obtain a clearance certificate. And that just doesn't match the time frame within which educators need to be appointed. So we need to see better enforcement, but we also need to see it becoming easier to actually access clearance certificates.
I mean, surely this is something that can be expedited by the government agencies involved, because the actual vetting of these teachers who come into contact with our children is a non-negotiable.
I mean, we completely agree. We think that it's of fundamental importance that the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development takes a very close look at the process that needs to be followed in obtaining a clearance certificate against the Register for Sex Offenders and tries to identify where the weak spots are. I mean, at the moment, you have to apply using a paper-based application to a provincial office, of which there's one per province. And you can already start to see there a process that flows like that is likely to be subject to significant bottlenecks, significant inadequacies. So we really do think we should be looking at those kind of processes.
Tell me, is the number that we have at the moment, which is answered by the Education Minister in Parliament, 81% of educators are still unvetted. Is this a decline from previous years? I mean, was there a stage when we were vetting our teachers to the extent where that was possible?
So unfortunately, it's actually not really a decline. I'd say it probably turns around and looks to be more like an increase. We haven't actually required vetting for a very long period of time. What's quite concerning as well is the current regulatory framework only requires and mandates the vetting of incoming teachers. So teachers only have to be vetted upon their appointment. That means once you are already appointed, you don't have to be vetted.
Oh, God.
And the harm of that is obviously there's no reason why during your appointment you wouldn't come to be registered on the register.
I mean, is this something that's in the line of sight of the Basic Education Department to implement this retrospectively?
I mean, look, when it comes to trying to implement it retrospectively, it might be a little bit difficult. There always are concerns about legality when it comes to retrospectively applying any law. But we do think there are significant public interest considerations here that would motivate actually changing the legal framework to, from as of now, require regular vetting of already employed teachers. It is recommended that SGBs vet their SGB-appointed educators every 2 years. We see no reason why a similar such requirement can't actually be inserted into the regulatory framework currently, and that would fix the problem moving forward.
I mean, do you think that it's actually just up to the school? That every individual school, no matter whether it's a private or public school, that they just need to take charge of the situation, and is that possible?
Look, it would be great if we could see schools really requiring this, but it does place a significant administrative burden on schools. And what we see currently is that, as I think I started off by saying, it really is the obligation of the employer. So in schools, in independent schools and schools that have a very high number of SGB posts, schools are the actual people responsible for vetting. But especially in no-fee paying schools where your teachers are appointed primarily by the department, it is very important that the department manages that administrative process, because the other concern is if you put that very strong administrative burden on schools, they might also find it difficult to execute. The department, with far greater resources, far greater capacity, is actually a better agent in this situation to ensure that their appointed educators are being vetted.
And having said all of that, it doesn't seem, at least on the face of it, I don't know, maybe there's a lot of work taking place in the background, but it doesn't seem like this is very high up on the department's agenda.
Unfortunately not, and I think we really need to drive to push it there. I mean, that's definitely work we're trying to consider at the Legal Resources Centre. I think it's something you're starting to see mounting public pressure on the department to take more seriously. And I think those are very, very important conversations to be had, because it's starting to actually shift the dial on how we view the vetting process and who's responsible, primarily the department.
And then, Claire, the vetting process is one thing, but in terms of the National Register for Sex Offenders, if we are going to vet teachers or anyone that comes into contact with our children against that national register, is the register up to date?
So that's the other thing. We're trying to, at the moment, figure out exactly what the interplay is when it comes to actually registering offenders on the register timeously. Something that's also just important to flag is that the department's not only required to vet educators against the National Registry for Sex Offenders, they're also required to vet educators against the National Child Protection Registry, which is administered by an entirely different government department, the Department of Social Development. And it's even less clear there how you actually see the registration of persons who've been decided to be unsuitable to work with children actually taking place. We're definitely trying to get to the bottom of it, but we do think there should be greater transparency from the administrating departments on this issue themselves.
Yeah. I mean, in the meantime, while we try to cut through all of this red tape, our children are more and more at risk. So vetting our teachers is one thing, but there are also other service providers that come onto school premises, right? We've got people doing reading campaigns, dance classes, and the like. These are all people who should be vetted before even setting foot on school grounds.
Yes, and that obligation should rest there with their employers. And we would, in that instance, say it's fully within schools' control and schools' responsibility to ensure that any independent service provider that they contract with is able to provide them with proof of vetting of the employees that are going to be coming into contact with their children. The law is very clear that persons who exercise authority over children in a particular situation have to be vetted against both registers.
Yeah, I mean, the only other sort of advice that we can give our viewers insofar as this issue is concerned, and the great risk in many respects that our children face going out into the world, is to educate the children on what they need to do, how they need to speak out.
Completely. And it's also very important that we don't just talk about vetting, we also talk about what the department does and what schools do when complaints of educator sexual misconduct actually come to light. We need to see very strong investigations, very strong enforcement mechanisms when these complaints are raised as well.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought that up, because there have been a number of stories in the news lately, and some of them that don't make it to the news, but relationships that unfold. I'm calling them relationships in quotes, because, of course, consent isn't possible in that scenario. But relationships between students and teachers. And often what we see is that the teachers are moved to other schools, and the process to get justice is unclear at best. How are you seeing this story unfold?
So again, the law really does differentiate here based on whether or not an educator is employed by the department or employed by school governing bodies or whatever other governing institution exists in independent schools. If it's a departmental post, and if the educator is employed by the department is responsible for, through arbitration, investigating and conducting a disciplinary hearing. And they're supposed to take 60 calendar days to do that. But what we know from talking to schools and what we know on the ground is that it is taking far longer for both the investigation and the required arbitration panel to actually convene and complete an investigation into any kind of complaint or report of educator sexual misconduct. So we really need to see better delivery on what is actually required of arbitration there. And then when it comes to instances where schools have control over the process, so where a teacher is filling an SGB post or it's an independent school, it's up to the school how to regulate that disciplinary process. They obviously have to comply with labor law requirements, but we do think that there is a bit of a gap there that we should actually see greater oversight from the department in. Obviously, the South African Council of Educators is another important role player here. Any complaint of educator sexual misconduct needs to be referred to them, and they conduct their own investigation into the matter that runs parallel to any disciplinary proceedings, but they also take a significant amount of time to complete any investigation. They're trying to assess if an educator has or can be found guilty of breaching their code of professional ethics, and they'll make a finding to that effect. But the problem is they're just not doing it quickly enough. And if an educator then moves to a different school, unless SACE is able to have a finding against them quickly, you'll start to see them actually be able to do exactly what you've just said, move on to somewhere else.
Sure. And in terms of parents and guardians taking the matter to the police, what are the possible implications there?
So the police will always get involved with a criminal investigation, and we would always think that it's best to try and refer the complaint through both parallel complaint mechanisms that are available. So one, going directly to SAPS and reporting it, because at the end of the day, this isn't just an issue about how a teacher has conducted themselves in school that needs to be resolved within a school context. It also often is a sign of very serious criminal conduct, and there needs to be a police investigation into the matter, prosecution where necessary, and that will only happen if it's referred to SAPS. At the same time, it should also be reported to the school so that the school is able to conduct its relevant disciplinary inquiry and take whatever steps are necessary within that particular school context.
It's incredibly worrying just how these various processes are unfolding. When we look at the GBV numbers in the country, the amount of threat that women and children live under in South Africa, and yet government departments are dragging their feet on these crucial issues.
No, we completely agree. It is devastating to see the consequences almost on a daily basis. It's completely unacceptable, and we really do call on the Department of Basic Education and the Department of Social Development and the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development to actually take better steps to show that they take this issue seriously, because at the moment, they are the three departments that are involved in this process.
Clair, Rankin, thanks very much indeed for your help in letting us understand just how important this is, this 81%, the fact that 81% of educators are still unchecked, and Clair telling us not only against the National Register for Sex Offenders, but also the Child Protection Register. Clair's an attorney at the Legal Resources Centre.